Well, God responds by throwing them out of the garden, but he doesn't leave them with nothing. What does he do for them?
Well, I found it really interesting, and I think I'd heard this before, but just, every time you go over these stories, I feel like something just
Yeah,
stands out to you. And it's
right.
one thing I love about doing this podcast with you is just some of these stories I haven't read word for word in a long time, right? Because you kind of know them, and you
Yeah.
think, just like I'm not going to go back and read Hemingway again. Like it's just like I know those stories, right? But when you have a reason to do it, it's fun. But in Genesis 3, chapter 21. I find it interesting that the fact that so again they've been kicked, they've eaten from the fruit, they've been kicked out of the garden. Um, the Lord God made garments out of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. It's like the very first thing he did was take care of them in their need, right?
And
Like
their
it was immediately.
nakedness.
Yeah, like it was the problem and it was the immediate need. God stepped in. Now again, the fact that it says skin kind of shows us a little about this life cycle conversation. Something had to give it skin for them to have clothes, right?
Right.
So if there was something that didn't have its skin anymore, and I don't think it could stay alive without its skin. But
I love how you always like to get into the one detail, like what does this mean? What does it mean when they say skin? It must means an animal must have died, and then he created clothing for them. And it is within the realm of our understanding to think that's probably true, right? How
but still
else
a
would it
God of
happen?
provision
Right.
for them immediate. So it's not like his feelings towards them changed at all, right?
Oh,
It's just like the relationship changed, the how things happen. Like you can't be in the garden anymore. These are curses that you now have. But he still, from the moment, was like, I'm going to take care of you.
what does it tell you or teach you about God that you already knew or that is something new to you?
I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is what I already articulated was the idea that, man, his provision was right away with the clothing, right? Like, I think that with the faith tradition I was brought up in was very punitive God, a very fire and brimstone God, which I think that there's artifacts of that are clearly true, right? God is a just God. He's a fair God. But it's not like he cursed them, shut the door, and was like, I'm gone for 2,000 years or whatever, right? Like he immediately said, all right, let's figure this out. I'm going to give you a small little piece of provision. The other thing that stands out to me in the story every time I go through it is just the fact of how it's told, like God was walking through the garden.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like this understanding of this omnipotent, every all times, everywhere God. He had a manifestation, at least in the telling of the story,
Right.
that's interesting, right? That I don't quite know what that means, but that's just always like to think of God as an actual entity rather than just something that's everywhere. It's a weird thought in my head.
Oh, I love that particular passage about God walking in the cool of the garden and then recognizing that Adam and Eve were hiding because it, to me, it kind of indicates how God loved to enjoy his creation being in the garden, and that also he was seeking out Adam and Eve for whatever reason, and then came to realize that something had happened. So yes, it does teach us that God, when he provides blessings and he also provides limitations, he really means it, right? Like, it isn't just well, maybe he'll do that. His word is his word. And so he was very clear to them. The way that I think about what it teaches us about God is that it was very clear to them what he expected. And it didn't seem like it was insurmountable what he was wanting them to do. In fact, it sounded like an amazing privilege to represent God and to worship him and love him and be in communion with him. And that they blew that privilege, which had to in some way be disappointing for God. I mean, he does demonstrate anger and frustration by saying, you're out of the garden and you can never come back. Because I can't be with you anymore. So he has high standards, but they're not unachievable.
Right.
So I really see this love characteristics, this provision, generosity, abundance, thoughtfulness, desire to be a part of our lives. And yet, at the same time, as you mentioned, a just creator who will not stand for evil in his presence and who wants to know whether his people are with him or not. Are you with me or not? And therefore, we all have to face this test of sorts. Are we with God or not?